More than 3,000 years of history obliterated in seconds. This video was released by ISIS. CNN cannot independently verify its authenticity, but it purports to show the radicals destroying Nimrud, one of the most important archaeological sites in Iraq. ISIS fighters used power tools to break down ancient statues, frescoes, and walls. These are remnants of the ancient Assyrian civilization. Nimrud used to be its capital. They stood since the 13th century BC and survived many wars, but were destroyed by the militants probably in less than a day.
It has become one of the most powerful fighting groups in the region. Thousands of Arab and foreign fighters make up its ranks. They are led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The mysterious figure was captured by US forces in Iraq in 2005, but was later released. The group has its origins in Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was killed by US forces in 2006, and the group became known as the Islamic State in Iraq under the leadership of Abu Umar al-Baghdadi. Baghdadi was killed by US and Iraqi forces in 2010, and the group got a new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, also known as Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri.
This is the unofficial affiliation of Al-Qaeda. It subscribes to Al-Qaeda's central ideology and tactics. Is one of the most extremist militant organizations in the jihadist family.
The group moved into Syria, but when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi tried to bring another jihadi group known as the Nusra Front under his control, Al-Qaeda disowned him. But that didn't stop Baghdadi's campaign. His group now controlled parts of northern and eastern Syria, including oil fields.
ISIS actually formed as a small insurgent group in Iraq in 2006. And while they tried to create problems for the U.S. military, they had no money and no real ability to recruit. It wasn't until 2009 that ISIS shifted its focus from Iraq, where it was largely unsuccessful in developing a foothold, and focused on Syria. By 2011, the Syrian civil war was getting underway, and ISIS had its chance. In June of 2013, a northern general for the Free Syrian Army spoke out on Al Jazeera, Qatar, and stated that if international forces did not send weapons, the rebels attempting to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would lose their war within a month. Well, within just a matter of weeks of that Syrian general making his plea for international help, the U.S., the Saudis, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel began providing weapons, training, and money to the so-called rebel groups like the Free Syrian Army. By September of 2013, American media outlets began reporting that weapons were being given to Syrian rebels. CNN reported that while the weapons were not American-made, they were funded and organized by the CIA. And this is where things all fell apart. Within less than 1 year after the U.S. supplied those Syrian so-called freedom fighters with weapons, those weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters. In fact, American media also began to report that the Free Syrian Army had fighters defecting from their ranks and joining with ISIS. By the time ISIS began to make headlines, President Obama himself acted as if ISIS were nothing to be worried about.
We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
The United States will not pursue military options that support one sect inside of Iraq at the expense of another. There's no military solution inside of Iraq, certainly not one that is led by the United States.
Well, by June of 2014, ISIS had emerged, going from a no-name group in Syria to crossing back over the border and into Iraq. Well, one of the reasons why ISIS was able to become so powerful so quickly was because of their ability to grab up U.S. military gear. We'll talk about that in a minute, but also because of the stunning amount of wealth that they've been accumulating, most of that coming from seizing oil fields in Iraq and in Syria.
Oil has been one of the most difficult resources to track in the struggle against ISIS. But the latest reports estimate that the terror group is making over $1 million a day from producing and smuggling the resource. That's several $million a week. And believe it or not, before September, the revenue stream was a lot higher than that. According to a recent report put out by the Financial Action Task Force, an international agency that follows terror financing, airstrikes against the group's oil infrastructure have brought that revenue down significantly. However, oil is still a huge financial booster for the terror group's operations. Keep in mind, ISIS now controls broad swaths of land in Iraq and Syria and oversees an estimated 6 million people. Because of that large population, there's a huge demand for oil within the region, fuel for cars, generators, and of course businesses. In fact, much of that oil is purchased by the very residents it oversees. But the remaining portion, according to that report, comes from sales made through smuggling the resource. That's where it gets a bit tricky. ISIS is paid mostly in cash for the oil it sells, making the transactions very, very hard to track. Several past reports have suggested that the oil is being smuggled into neighboring countries, including Syria, Turkey, Iran, and even Jordan. In a November Guardian report, Iraqi intelligence officials said that ISIS was using the Anbar province, which shares a border with Jordan, as a major smuggling hub. Considering all the oil fields ISIS controls, along with the roads surrounding them, it doesn't come as a huge surprise, but it has fueled a lot of questions over whether the U.S. and its allies can or will do anything to crack down on those purchasing the oil, thereby further straining the group's financial supply. Reporting in Washington, Amira David, RT.
So again, how did we get here? Well, let's go back to the very beginning, because when ISIS was making that march back from Syria and into Iraq, when they got into Iraq, they found that the Iraqi army was no challenge for them, no resistance at all. Again, this is an army trained by the U.S. and left with tens of thousands of military vehicles, Bearcats, tanks, MRAPs, armored vehicles, and weapons, all of which were easily taken by ISIS. So why did the Iraqi army fail so miserably? RT correspondent Manuel Rapolo has that part of the story.
For many, it came as a shock when the Iraqi army, backed and well armed by the United States, folded to the invading forces of the Islamic State, or ISIS. But why? How could an entire army, funded at a cost of $25 billion, shouldered by U.S. taxpayers, simply fold to a relatively unknown group of Islamic militants? Simple answer is that it's really not that simple. In fact, it's a whole host of factors that set up Iraq's army to fail from the start. Consider that the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein was entirely disbanded in 2003 following the American invasion of Iraq. With the army gone, there was no more hierarchy, no more experienced generals or experienced soldiers like those that fought in the Iran-Iraq war to take control of securing Iraq when the U.S. finally pulled its forces from the country. Of course, there's also the countless allegations of corruption within the government of Nouri al-Maliki, where even U.S. government workers in Iraq knew how fragile Iraqi politics were before handing over control of the country to national security forces. One former military advisor told Al Jazeera in 2014 that, quote, the Maliki government has spent a lot of time over the past 5 years alienating the Sunnis, and that's not how you create an effective security force that has high morale. It was a little bit of a rotten edifice to begin with. And even before the Islamic State's sprawl across Iraq and into Syria, we can point to the countless headlines that we kept seeing week after week. First, it was that ISIS had taken over one of the largest dams in Iraq, threatening to flood major cities. Then it was a bank robbery where bandit militants made off with hundreds of millions of dollars. Then, of course, was the most troubling realization of all, that as the Iraqi army retreated and conceded, countless U.S. weapons fell into the hands of the Islamic State. M16s, AK-47s, rocket launchers, tanks, and armored vehicles, all of which are now being used by the very people the U.S. is officially at war with. Today, it's been reported that the Iraqi army is at best half the size that it was when the U.S. pulled out of the country, reigniting debate here in Washington over whether or not U.S. forces will once again step in. Manuel Rapolo, RT Studios, Washington.
So there you have it. The Iraqi military simply fell apart when faced by ISIS, and in doing so, as Manuel mentioned, turned over so much military equipment to the group. How much are we talking about? Well, take this into consideration. The U.S. military left in Iraq about 4 million pieces of equipment valued at $580 million. However, the military said that they were saving $1 billion in shipping costs by not bringing it back to the States. And yet that's not much of a savings when we're now sending $500 million to the FSA to fight ISIS. So here we are. ISIS has control of portions of Syria and northern Iraq.
Noam Chomsky joins us now from Boston.
Well, ISIS is an utter monstrosity. It's an outgrowth of essentially two factors. First, the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq, which incited sectarian conflicts, which are now tearing the country and, in fact, by now the region apart. And secondly, the extremist fundamentalist doctrines, along with funding, coming from Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. Those have converged and created a major monstrosity.
So the question then arises, where exactly does ISIS get the funding that it needs in order to seize power in the region? Well, it's thought that the group has powerful sponsors in the Gulf states which fund its activities. ISIS is also involved in smuggling, extortion and bank robberies. In the course of its rapid advance on Baghdad, the group took control of stockpiles of US-made weaponry. And even Washington has played its role in the rise of ISIS, as RT's Marina Portnaya explains.
The newest terrorist organization, known as ISIS, is overtaking al-Qaeda's reign as public enemy #1. Sunni Islamic militants are unleashing brutality and bloodshed in Iraq. But it's next door, in Syria, during a 3-year civil war, where the extremist group got its start.
We are where we are because we armed the Syrian rebels. We have been fighting alongside al-Qaeda, fighting alongside ISIS. ISIS is now emboldened in 2 countries. But here's the anomaly. We're with ISIS in Syria. We're on the same side of the war. So those who want to get involved to stop ISIS in Iraq are allied with ISIS in Syria. That is the real contradiction to this whole policy.
Right. According to reports, the U.S. government may have inadvertently played a direct role in strengthening extremists.
There are also allegations that the United States may have been involved in some of the training of these ISIS insurgents at a training camp in Jordan. So the Saudis, the Qataris, others are directly involved in this regime change policy in Syria and in Iraq, and the United States has helped and created these conditions. And this will cause chaos and expanding war in the region.
According to German magazine Der Spiegel, Americans were still in Jordan in March of last year, training up to 1,200 members of the Free Syrian Army to use anti-tank weaponry.
We have spent a lot of time trying to work with a moderate opposition in Syria.
The Obama administration has requested $500 million to arm and train Syrian rebels fighting to topple President Bashar Assad. U.S. officials claim only appropriate vetted members of the moderate Syrian opposition will receive American weapons and ammo. Problem is, it's not always easy to differentiate between the moderate and terrorist. Here's U.S. Senator John McCain posing with members of ISIS. The photo is now reportedly being circulated by the group as proof of their legitimacy.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. We're continuing our coverage of the ongoing turmoil in Iraq. Now with the rise of the extremist group, the Islamic State, the drums of war in Iraq are beating louder and louder in the mainstream press. I'm pleased to welcome our guest Nafeez Ahmed to help us put things in perspective. Nafeez is a best-selling author, investigative journalist, and international security scholar who writes regularly for The Guardian. He has a new novel out called 0 Point, which he says anticipated the Iraq crisis that's going on right now. Thanks for joining us, Nafeez.
Thanks, Jessica.
Can you sort of give us a sense of the evolution of this extremist group and how they got started?
Well, the origins of the group come from militant groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda that were operating in Iraq and Syria. And that's where it gets murky because, as we know, these groups were kind of engaged in all kinds of militant activity fighting the Assad regime. They were also active in responding to US occupation after the 2003 invasion. So there's a mix of different actors involved. So in Iraq, you know, we had elements of even the Ba'ath Party and ex-Saddam supporters who were actually, according to many reports, they were being recruited by these Al-Qaeda militants. And in Syria, you know, we had this increasing kind of, you know, the borders, the separation between the Iraq groups and the Syria groups, it became increasingly, you know, much more porous because, you know, they were They were fighting back and forth. They were crossing borders. And what makes it more murky is how these groups really became